He married his own mother, not in secret, not on the run. He signed legal documents, stood in public, and went on to raise 4 children who believed they were living inside a normal family. For decades, no one stopped it. Not the town, not the records office, not the people who suspected the truth, but decided it was easier to stay quiet. This isn't a story about shock. It's a story about what happens when control is mistaken for care, and when an entire community agrees, silently, to look the other way. Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from, and stay with this story, because what happened after the truth came out was far more disturbing than the secret itself. In a quiet rural county, where records were still kept on paper and names were passed down like heirlooms, there lived a man everyone called Thomas Hale. He was known as dependable, reserved, almost invisible. He worked at the same mill for 30 years, married late, and raised 4 children who were polite, well-behaved, and rarely asked questions. From the outside, his life looked ordinary, too ordinary to invite curiosity. But the foundation of that life was built on a secret so deeply buried that even Thomas himself avoided thinking about it. Thomas never knew his father. His birth certificate listed only a surname and a blank space where a name should have been. His mother, Eleanor, was young when she had him, already isolated, already living under the quiet judgment of a town that remembered everything but forgave nothing. As Thomas grew, Eleanor became more than a parent. She was his teacher, his employer, his entire world. He was homeschooled, worked the land beside her, and learned early that their survival depended on silence. When Thomas turned 22, Eleanor married him. There was no celebration, no church, no announcement. The paperwork listed her as a widow, Thomas as a man with no recorded parents. In that town, records were rarely questioned if they looked complete enough. People whispered, but whispers fade when no one dares to ask directly. What looked like an odd pairing, a stern older woman and a quiet younger husband, was explained away as necessity. She needed help, people said. He needed a home. Over the years, 4 children were born. They were raised with rigid structure. No visitors stayed long. No questions about grandparents were welcomed. Family photos were few, carefully chosen, always recent. The children were taught respect, obedience, and above all, privacy. Thomas worked endlessly, not out of ambition but fear. Fear that one mistake, one loose word, would expose a truth that would destroy not only him, but the children who depended on him. To his children, Thomas was gentle but distant. Eleanor was authoritative, cold, and precise. She controlled the household like a system that could never afford disruption. Love was expressed through routine, not affection. The children learned early that some subjects were simply not spoken about. When Eleanor died, the silence finally began to crack. Thomas aged quickly after her death, as though the weight he carried had been structural, holding him upright only through tension. Without her presence, the house felt wrong, empty in places it shouldn't have been. It was during the sorting of old documents, land records, birth certificates, letters never mailed, that the truth surfaced. One of the children found an original birth record. Another found a faded letter addressed to Eleanor, written decades earlier, warning her never to register Thomas's birth under her own name. The pieces didn't fall together all at once. They resisted alignment, but eventually the truth became unavoidable. Their father was also their brother. Their mother was also their grandmother. There was no confrontation, no shouting, no dramatic scene, only a long, quiet understanding that settled into the room like dust. Thomas did not deny it when asked. He didn't justify it either. He simply said, "It started before I knew I had a choice." The authorities were never involved. Eleanor was gone. The children were adults. The damage had already been done in ways no court could untangle. What remained was the aftermath, identity confusion, anger, grief, and the unbearable realization that their entire upbringing had been shaped by a secret designed to protect them, yet costing them the truth. Thomas lived the rest of his life alone. He did not remarry. He did not defend himself publicly. He accepted his children's distance as deserved. When he died, his obituary was simple. No mention of Eleanor, no family history, just a man who worked hard, raised 4 children, and left behind more questions than answers. The town never spoke of it openly. But some stories don't disappear. They wait, quietly, for someone to uncover them and realize that sometimes the most disturbing truths are not born from cruelty, but from fear, isolation, and the slow erosion of choice. Long before the paperwork was signed and the town learned to look the other way, the shape of Thomas's life had already been decided for him. Eleanor did not raise him with violence or overt cruelty. What she used instead was something far more effective: dependence. From early childhood, Thomas was taught that the world beyond their land was unsafe, judgmental, and eager to take him away. Every story she told him carried the same lesson. Outsiders ruin families, questions lead to separation, and survival belongs only to those who remain loyal. Thomas never attended a regular school. Eleanor claimed she couldn't trust teachers with private matters. She taught him herself, choosing what he learned and, more importantly, what he never encountered. History stopped where it became inconvenient. Biology was simplified into chores and livestock. Morality was framed as obedience. By the time Thomas was old enough to notice that other boys his age spoke differently, dreamed differently, wanted differently, he had already internalized the idea that wanting anything beyond his mother's approval was dangerous. As he grew older, Eleanor's authority shifted subtly. She stopped calling him her son in public. She referred to him as Thomas instead of my boy. At home, she spoke of partnership, of shared responsibility, of how the land would not survive without both of them. When neighbors hinted that he should leave, marry someone his own age, start a life elsewhere, Eleanor became ill for days at a time. Not dramatically, just enough to remind Thomas that her well-being depended on him staying. By the time the marriage occurred, Thomas's sense of choice had been eroded to almost nothing. He didn't experience the moment as rebellion or desire. He experienced it as inevitability. The paperwork felt less like a commitment and more like another chore, like fixing a fence or signing a land deed. Eleanor framed it as protection. "This way," she told him, "no one can separate us. No one can take what we've built." The children came years later, spaced carefully, planned quietly. Eleanor managed every detail. She decided when it was safe, when it was necessary, when the household could handle another. Thomas participated, but never initiated. He became a father in title before he understood what fatherhood meant. What he understood was work, providing food, maintaining order, keeping the household functioning so no one would look too closely. Inside the home, love was expressed through control. The children were clean, fed, educated, but emotionally contained. Questions were answered with finality, not discussion. Family trees were simplified. Holidays were small. Birthdays passed without guests. Eleanor insisted this was humility, privacy, safety. Thomas told himself it was normal because he had never known anything else. But cracks began to form as the children grew older. They noticed the way their parents never touched in public, the way Eleanor spoke for Thomas, even when he was present, the way their father deferred, always. At school, classmates asked harmless questions. Where were their grandparents? Why was their mother so much older? Why did their father never talk about his childhood? The children learned to deflect without understanding why. They inherited secrecy before they inherited truth. Thomas felt it too, a growing discomfort that he couldn't name. Watching his children reach the same age he had been when his life narrowed into one path, seeing in them a curiosity he had been trained to suppress. Sometimes, late at night, he imagined what might have happened if someone, anyone, had intervened when he was younger. A teacher, a neighbor, a relative. But imagining did nothing except remind him that the life he lived now was irreversible. Eleanor aged, but her control did not weaken. Even as her health declined, she maintained authority through routines and reminders. She kept documents locked away. She corrected the children when they spoke too freely. She reminded Thomas that exposure would not only destroy him, but them, that the children would carry the stigma forever, that silence was not just protection, it was love. By the time Eleanor died, the family had existed in this closed system for decades. The children were adults, but still shaped by the boundaries set long before they could question them. Thomas, without Eleanor's voice guiding him, felt unmoored. The rules he had followed so faithfully were suddenly quiet, leaving him alone with a truth he had spent his entire life avoiding. And that silence, unmanaged, unexplained, and finally unguarded, became more dangerous than any confession. The truth did not arrive all at once. It crept in through paperwork, through inconsistencies, through small questions that had waited decades for permission to be asked. After Eleanor's death, the house no longer felt governed by rules, but by absence. Rooms once carefully controlled became still. Drawers that had always been locked were suddenly accessible. Thomas did not stop his children from sorting through things. He told himself it was practical. Documents needed organizing, the estate needed clarity, but part of him understood that this moment had been coming for a long time. The first discovery seemed harmless. An old birth certificate, yellowed and folded into a ledger, listing Thomas's name without a mother. The children assumed it was a clerical error, the kind common in rural counties decades earlier. But then they found another record. An amended marriage document, filed years after the ceremony, correcting details that no one remembered being wrong. Dates adjusted, names aligned too neatly. The paperwork told a story of someone revisiting the past repeatedly, reshaping it just enough to hold together. Confusion turned into unease. The children began comparing what they had been told against what they could now see. Family timelines no longer made sense. Eleanor's age at Thomas's birth conflicted with stories she had told them about her youth. The absence of grandparents, once explained as tragedy or distance, now felt deliberate. Even childhood memories shifted under new light, moments when Eleanor corrected strangers too quickly, or when Thomas avoided conversations about his early years with an intensity that had once seemed like modesty. When they finally asked Thomas directly, he did not answer immediately. He sat longer than necessary, as if weighing not what to say, but whether speech itself would break something permanently. When he did speak, his words were slow and carefully chosen, not defensive, not emotional. He did not frame what happened as love or desire. He described it as something that formed, something that was decided before I understood it. He told them he had never known how to imagine a different life because no alternative had ever been presented as safe or possible. The children did not react uniformly. One withdrew completely, retreating into silence, refusing to ask follow-up questions. Another demanded clarity, dates, explanations that could be organized into something comprehensible. The third oscillated between anger and grief, struggling with the sense that their entire upbringing had been structured around a lie meant to protect them. The fourth, youngest, always the most observant, listened quietly, already recognizing that no explanation would feel complete. What unsettled them most was not the revelation itself, but the realization of how long it had been managed. This wasn't a single moment of wrongdoing. It was a system, a structure reinforced daily through behavior, routine, and emotional conditioning. The secrecy had been inherited before it was understood. They had learned how to keep quiet without knowing what they were protecting. Thomas did not ask for forgiveness. He did not claim victimhood either. He acknowledged responsibility without assigning blame outward. Eleanor was never spoken of harshly, but neither was she defended. He described her as someone who believed survival justified everything, someone who feared exposure more than damage, someone who convinced herself that control was care. The family did not go to authorities. There was no legal path forward that promised clarity or relief. Eleanor was gone. The children were adults. Public exposure would not undo the past. It would only redefine it under scrutiny that offered no healing. What remained was the quieter, harder work of understanding who they were in the aftermath of what they had learned. Relationships changed. Conversations became cautious. Family gatherings felt strained, not because of hostility, but because each interaction carried an unspoken awareness. The children struggled with identity in ways they could not easily articulate. Simple questions, medical history, ancestry, family resemblance, now felt dangerous. They found themselves questioning memories they had once trusted, wondering which parts of their childhood were genuine and which were shaped to maintain the illusion. Thomas aged rapidly during this period. Without the structure Eleanor had enforced, his life lost definition. He continued working, continued routines, but something fundamental had shifted. The role he had played for decades, provider, protector, keeper of silence, no longer had a clear purpose. His children no longer depended on him in the same way, and he no longer knew how to exist outside the framework that had shaped him since youth. The secret, once exposed, did not explode. It didn't destroy the family instantly. Instead, it spread quietly, altering everything it touched. Trust became conditional. Love became complicated. And the truth, finally spoken, proved heavier than the silence that had hidden it for so long. After the truth surfaced, the most difficult burden was not what had happened, but what it meant going forward. The family discovered quickly that knowledge does not bring clarity. It brings instability. Once the foundation of their identity had been disturbed, everything built on top of it felt uncertain. Names, roles, relationships that had once felt fixed now seemed provisional, as though they could collapse under the weight of a single question asked too honestly. Each of the children reacted differently, but all of them experienced the same underlying fracture. The realization that their personal history was no longer reliable. Childhood memories became suspect. Moments once recalled as warm or neutral now carried an undertone of manipulation. Even affection felt compromised, not because it had been false, but because it had been shaped within a system designed to conceal rather than nurture. Medical forms became a source of anxiety. Family history, once a box ticked without thought, now required pauses, evasions, or lies they resented having to continue. Relationships outside the family grew strained. How much could they tell partners, friends, or spouses without turning their lives into spectacles? How much silence was protection, and how much was complicity? Thomas watched this unraveling with quiet resignation. He understood, perhaps better than anyone, what it meant to live inside a distorted narrative. For most of his life, he had functioned by narrowing his world to what was survivable. Now, he saw his children struggling not with survival, but with meaning. He tried to help in the only way he knew, by staying out of the way. He answered questions when asked, but he did not volunteer explanations. He believed mistakenly that distance might reduce the damage. What haunted the children most was the absence of a clear villain. Eleanor's actions could not be excused, but neither could they be reduced to simple cruelty. She had operated from fear, isolation, and a belief that exposure was worse than harm. Thomas, too, existed in a grey space, both shaped by control and responsible for perpetuating it. This lack of moral clarity made anger difficult to sustain. There was no single point where blame could rest without spilling outward. The family attempted normalcy, but normalcy requires shared assumptions. Holidays were quieter, conversations avoided the past, unless necessary. Laughter, when it came, felt cautious, as though joy itself might be inappropriate. They were not broken beyond repair, but they were permanently altered, forced to negotiate relationships without the comfort of inherited stories or generational continuity. Therapy was discussed, sometimes attempted, but even there, language failed them. How does one explain a childhood that was stable on the surface, yet fundamentally distorted beneath? How do you describe a father who was also a victim, a mother who was also an architect of harm? Professionals listened, but the family sensed the limits of understanding. Their experience existed outside standard categories. Thomas's health declined steadily. Without Eleanor's rigid structure, he seemed to lose direction. He had lived most of his life responding to rules rather than forming desires. Now, with nothing left to enforce and no future plans to execute, time stretched uncomfortably. He spent hours sitting in the same chair, not reminiscing, but avoiding memory altogether. When asked what he regretted most, he did not mention the marriage or the secrecy. He said only that he wished he had learned earlier how to imagine a different life. The children, meanwhile, faced the slow work of reconstruction. They had to decide what parts of their upbringing they could keep without endorsing the system that produced it. They had to redefine family on their own terms, choosing connection rather than obligation, honesty rather than inherited silence. It was not a clean process. Progress came unevenly, interrupted by setbacks, resentment, and grief. What remained consistent was the understanding that the damage did not end with exposure. Truth did not resolve their story, it complicated it. It demanded ongoing effort, constant negotiation between empathy and accountability. The family learned that survival alone was not enough. Without reflection, survival simply repeats itself in quieter forms. And so they lived with the aftermath, not as a single revelation, but as a permanent condition, one that required vigilance, honesty, and the willingness to accept that some wounds do not close cleanly, but can still be carried without defining the entirety of a life. The town had always known, at least partially, not in specifics, not in language precise enough to be repeated, but in the way people know things they choose not to examine. Eleanor and Thomas were never fully invisible. Their life unfolded in plain sight, framed carefully enough to discourage questions. An older woman marrying a much younger man had raised eyebrows, but eyebrows eventually lowered. Curiosity dulled into habit. Habit became acceptance. In places like that town, silence was not accidental. It was cultural. People understood which topics disrupted stability and which could be ignored in the name of peace. The marriage was categorized as unusual, then quietly reclassified as private. Over time, even the unusual lost its edge. The couple paid taxes, raised children who behaved well, kept to themselves. They fulfilled every outward requirement of respectability. And respectability, the town believed, was proof enough. Neighbors remembered moments that unsettled them. Eleanor answering questions meant for Thomas, the children being kept close to home, the lack of extended family. Some suspected something was wrong, but suspicion requires follow-through, and follow-through demands risk. Reporting concerns would have meant scrutiny, conflict, and the possibility of being wrong. It was easier to believe the explanation offered than to confront the discomfort of doubt. Local institutions mirrored that attitude. Clerks processed documents without challenge. Officials corrected records when asked, trusting that legality equaled legitimacy. Teachers noticed the children's guardedness, but attributed it to strict parenting. Doctors recorded limited family histories and moved on. Each small act of non-intervention reinforced the larger system that allowed the secret to endure. No single person was responsible for the silence, which made it powerful. When Eleanor died and the truth began to circulate quietly, the town's reaction was subdued. There was no outrage, no collective reckoning. People spoke in hushed tones, using phrases like complicated, sad, or better left alone. Sympathy was extended selectively, often toward the children, rarely toward Thomas. Eleanor became an abstract figure, referred to in vague terms that avoided moral evaluation. The town never apologized. Communities rarely do. Instead, it adjusted its narrative, framing the situation as an unfortunate anomaly rather than a failure of shared responsibility. By distancing itself from the story, the town preserved its image as orderly, decent, uninvolved. What happened was described as happening within the family, not around it. For the children, this response was deeply unsettling. They realized that secrecy had not been maintained by their parents alone, but by an entire environment that valued comfort over intervention. The same neighbors who now expressed pity had once chosen not to ask questions. The same systems that now quietly distanced themselves had once enabled the illusion of normalcy. Thomas sensed this too. In his final years, he rarely left the house, not out of shame, but exhaustion. The town's silence mirrored the life he had lived, structured, contained, unchallenged, until it was too late to matter. He understood that if someone had spoken earlier, everything might have been different, but he also understood that the town's silence had protected him as much as it had trapped him. The story, such as it was, never became public in any formal way. There were no headlines, no court cases, no official records acknowledging what had occurred. It survived instead as fragmented memory, passed quietly between people who half remembered and half denied. Over time, even that faded. What endured was not outrage, but discomfort, a lingering awareness that something deeply wrong had existed alongside ordinary life, unchallenged because it was easier not to see. The town returned to routine, but the family did not. They carried with them the knowledge that truth, once uncovered, does not demand attention from the world, only from those who must live with it. And in that imbalance lay the final injustice, not that the secret existed, but that so many people had helped it remain intact without ever believing they were responsible. Thomas died on an ordinary morning. No announcement preceded it, no sudden urgency. His body simply gave out after years of living without direction, as though the effort of maintaining silence had been the force keeping him upright. When the call came, the children responded not with panic, but with a muted sense of inevitability. They had been preparing for this moment long before his health failed, preparing not for grief, but for the absence of unfinished explanations. The funeral was small. Few people attended beyond immediate family and a handful of neighbors who felt it was expected rather than necessary. There was no mention of Eleanor in the service. No family history was recited. The words chosen were safe ones. Hard-working, quiet, devoted. They were not lies, but they were incomplete, shaped once again by the instinct to keep the past contained. Afterward, the children sorted through what remained of the house. They worked methodically, as if distance could be created through organization. Some items were kept: tools, letters unrelated to the past, photographs taken after Eleanor's death. Others were destroyed without discussion. There was no argument about what should be preserved. Each of them understood that not all records deserve survival. What surprised them most was not how much anger they felt, but how little. Time had softened outrage into something more complex. They had come to understand that Thomas's life was not one he had chosen freely, but one he had never been taught to question. That understanding did not absolve him, but it did contextualize him. He had lived within constraints imposed so early and so thoroughly that resistance had become unimaginable. The children went on to live separate lives. They did not remain close in the way families often are, but they did not sever ties either. Their connection was defined less by affection and more by shared responsibility, to carry the truth without allowing it to consume them. Each approached it differently. One chose distance and anonymity. Another chose openness, carefully framing the story when necessary, refusing to let it define every aspect of their identity. The others settled somewhere in between. None of them repeated the patterns they had been raised within. That, more than anything, felt like resolution. The town eventually forgot the details. Stories blurred, names faded. What remained was a vague memory of something strange that had happened long ago. Communities are skilled at forgetting what challenges their sense of order. The family did not expect acknowledgement or apology. They had learned that institutions rarely take responsibility for what they enable through silence. What endured instead was a quieter reckoning, one that lived within the children themselves. They understood that harm does not always arrive through force. Sometimes it arrives through fear, isolation, and the steady narrowing of choices until obedience feels like safety. They recognized how easily systems, families, towns, institutions can preserve damage simply by refusing to look too closely. In the end, the story was not about scandal. It was about what happens when protection becomes control, when silence replaces care, and when survival is mistaken for love. The children carried that understanding forward, not as a burden, but as a responsibility, to question what feels unquestionable and to intervene where others might choose comfort instead. Some truths do not demand exposure, they demand reflection, and in that reflection, the cycle finally ended.